Between 5,000 and 15,000 men were imprisoned in concentration camps as homosexual offenders. This group of prisoners was typically required to wear a pink triangle badge sewn into their camp uniforms. These badges enabled SS guards to identify the alleged groups for incarceration. According to many survivor accounts, pink triangle male prisoners were among the most abused groups in the camps. SS guards murdered homosexual prisoners out of cruelty or during sadistic games.
The cruelty coined under the Nazi mantle knows no bounds. As we have just heard, homosexual people were another group within the long list of those persecuted by Adolf Hitler's regime, questioned for their orientation, abused, and marginalized. But this did not apply only to gay men. Lesbian women also suffered enormously under his rule. For many members of the National Socialist Party, they were decadent and immoral people, partly responsible for having led the once powerful German nation to ruin. Worse still, they were women who defied the role that Nazism had assigned to them. Their role was to populate the planet with Aryan children, but their sexuality went against that. It is not surprising then that many of them ended their days in concentration camps, where they suffered torture, sexual abuse, and even death. They were another of the minorities that Nazism sought by all possible means to eliminate from the face of the earth. Today, in this new military history video, we will tell you all about the cruel experiences of lesbian women under Nazism. The National Socialist Party, with Adolf Hitler at its head, came to power in Germany in 1933. During his political campaign, the Führer had always made his position clear. The Aryan race, of which the German people had once been the proudest representative, was in decline. The nation's external enemies were to blame. It is known that Jews were the most severely persecuted by the Nazis, but they were not the only ones. Among their other victims were gypsies, people with disabilities, those with different political or religious views, and also homosexual men and women. The latter were considered a perversion, guilty of deteriorating the purity of the superior German race. Men were more persecuted than women, considered mentally ill and very often transferred to concentration camps just because of their gender ideology. But while lesbians did not suffer the same level of harassment, they also fell prey to Nazism. They were blamed for lowering Germany's birth rate and therefore being one of the reasons that the German people were on the verge of collapse. So many ended up being arrested and taken to detention centers scattered throughout the Reich, where they were tortured and raped. This dangerous scenario for these women was in stark contrast to their situation just a few decades earlier. After the end of World War I in 1918, Germany, then called the Weimar Republic, was nourished by the new social ideas that were circulating in Europe at the time. Its people enjoyed a surprising level of cultural freedom, where traditional norms were questioned without much censorship. This also applied to the sexual issue. In the main urban centers of the country, several homosexual communities emerged, which could promote themselves in the media without fear of being persecuted. Even newspapers run by lesbian women emerged, inviting not only their equals but anyone interested to weekly meetings. In turn, several female writers began publishing novels that explored these themes, which were new to much of the German public. This freedom, however, was not shared by gay men. Their relationships were criminalized by law, and many of their most vocal advocates had been sent to prison. A large number of lesbian communities joined forces with these persecuted groups to try to overturn the injunctions that prohibited unions between men. This led to greater publicity for sexual minorities.
And sex researcher Magnus Hirschfeld, as well as others, organized gay and lesbian friendship leagues, which also included heterosexual members. These groups advocated for the decriminalization of sexual relations between men and the repeal of paragraph 175, which from 1871 banned sexual relations between men. In this endeavor, they found allies on the political left and center.
But while, as mentioned, the Weimar Republic enjoyed certain privileges not found in other regions of the world, not all German citizens agreed. Many viewed such homosexual relationships as immoral and decadent, and were against the newspapers, novels, and films that publicized them. One of the most openly opposed groups was, of course, the Nazi Party. As mentioned above, they grouped these people together with Jews and communists as the main causes of the nation's deterioration and the corruption of its culture. Even before coming to power, making use of the level of support among the population, they carried out several hostile confrontations between the two groups, which ended with injuries and arrests by the police. It is striking then that one of the most powerful men in the party at that time was gay. This was Ernst Röhm, the leader of the Assault Section, or SA, as the main Nazi paramilitary organization was known. They served as the armed wing of the party before Heinrich Himmler's SS rose to prominence. The other leaders, including Adolf Hitler, looked the other way when anyone dared to question Röhm's position and his homosexuality. Demonstrating their complete hypocrisy, they accepted him into their ranks while people like him were persecuted and harassed.
The SS and Gestapo chief, Heinrich Himmler, who was later largely responsible for Röhm's murder, saw homosexuality as a threat to the state. Himmler believed that homosexual men strove to infiltrate state structures, which, however, did not strengthen them, but on the contrary, led to the destruction of the state.
Röhm, for his part, did not seem to find any contradictions between the ideology to which he subscribed and his way of life. When the Nazis came to power and homosexual people began to be officially persecuted, the men of his assault section were often behind these actions. Gay and lesbian communities began to find themselves under attack, and every meeting they organized ran the risk of being invaded by the party security apparatus. The bars where they met went underground, as the police kept a close watch on known establishments. In addition, newspapers from these communities were banned and homosexual authors censored. Germany, which had served as a center for the exchange of new ideas about gender and sexuality, quickly became an enemy of these people. But the situation was soon to get worse. Relationships between men suffered the most serious attacks. The law that prohibited such ties was amended to be even more severe. Any male accused of same-gender sexual acts could be sentenced to 10 years of hard labor. Some were even castrated as punishment. Others were manipulated into giving themselves up voluntarily in exchange for lighter sentences. No conclusive evidence was needed for sentences to be carried out, since anyone accused of being homosexual was, for the judges, almost automatically guilty. The Gestapo, the Nazi secret police, had been put in charge of persecuting members of these communities. While, as stated, they focused primarily on gay men, lesbians were also harassed. Those suspected of being gay were investigated and interrogated and could be imprisoned for short periods, but their relationships, unlike those of their male counterparts, were not criminalized. For the National Socialists, there was a fundamental difference between these two groups. Gay men were decadents who served no purpose in society. For this reason, they were to be sent to forced labor camps, and when they had outlived their usefulness, they could be eliminated. But lesbians were first and foremost women, and they had a fundamental role in the future of the Reich. They were responsible for having pure Aryan children in order to spread the superior German race across the planet. This ideology was grouped under the organization Lebensborn, which means source of life. Through this association, wives of members of the German army, as well as single mothers, were provided with homes and financial assistance to raise their children. But many other women were also included in the program to be impregnated by Nazi officers or soldiers. Polygamy was rewarded, and each mother was expected to produce numerous babies. That was her only role in German society. Of course, both parents were always expected to have the desired genes, and if the child had a disability, it was cold-bloodedly murdered.
They were sent to hospitals and they were killed. Euthanasie. These were victims of euthanasie. Children had to be perfect, of course. And if there was somebody who was not okay, they were sent to special, what they say, special treatment. Special treatment was killing. Yeah. And so we don't know how many were killed, because this, of course, was much more secret than anything else.
Lesbians were, of course, not interested in this aspect. But the Nazi leaders thought that they could be easily persuaded to participate, and so they were not harassed as much as gay men. If these women still refused to serve the party, no one forbade the Nazis to simply force them. Faced with these new dangers, a large number of Aryan lesbians decided to hide their sexuality. Some went so far as to marry men, or at least to be seen in public pretending to be heterosexual. Others, however, defied the Nazi regime by joining resistance groups. Many of them helped gay men or members of other persecuted minorities to go underground. But for those lesbian women who were not of the German race, their future was even darker. Although they were not sought for their sexual orientation as they were not of pure blood, many were taken to concentration camps. In the archives of these places, although lesbianism was not cited as the reason for the arrest, this fact was usually noted. In addition, it should be noted that many of the arrests occurred because of a complaint from a neighbor or other person. Lesbians, even though they were not breaking any law with their activities, were often seen by other citizens as immoral and social outcasts, and therefore easy prey for persecution. Police and members of the Gestapo generally investigated these cases, as they suspected that these women might have ties to other underground groups, charged with helping Jews or sabotaging the German war effort. An example of this occurred in 1940, with the Second World War already underway. Ellie Smula and Margaret Rosenberg were two women who worked as tram drivers in the city of Berlin. According to complaints from their fellow workers, they had a habit of bringing female colleagues home, getting them drunk and having relations with them. For this reason, they were often not fit to drive their vehicles. When the Gestapo investigated the case, they accused both of having sexual orientation, interfered with their duties for the regime, and they were imprisoned for subversion. Both were sent to the Ravensbrück concentration camp near the German capital, which was intended only for female prisoners. Their arrests were attributed to political motives, but their lesbianism was clearly marked. Margaret survived the war, but Ellie died mysteriously in 1943. The reason for her death was never known. Of course, this was not the only case that ended in tragedy. Let us now learn about the dark end of Henny Sherman.
In 1938, as one way of identifying Jews, a Nazi ordinance decreed that Sarah was to be added in official papers as a middle name for all Jewish women. In early 1940, Henny was arrested in Frankfurt and sent to the Ravensbrück concentration camp for women.
Behind her mugshot was written, Henny Sarah Sherman, born 19th February 1912, Frankfurt am Main, licentious lesbian, only visits lesbian bars. She became another of the millions of people sent to the gas chambers, where she died at just 30 years old. Most of her family suffered the same fate. We cannot say for certain whether her sexual orientation served as a reason for her murder, but if it did, it would not be surprising. In the camps, homosexual prisoners were marked with a pink triangle on their uniform, so that everyone, especially the guards, would know their orientation. Those detained with this insignia, according to survivors' testimonies, were cruelly persecuted by the camp security staff. Many were summarily executed simply for their homosexuality. The triangles were said to serve as targets for Nazis to shoot at, for target practice. Around 15,000 men were taken to these terrible places, and thousands of them would never leave. Due to the constant torture they were subjected to, sometimes even sexual abuse, their life expectancy was particularly low. Even other prisoners took part in the torment, since the stigma of homosexuality was not only held by the Nazis, their own fellow prisoners in the concentration camp took part in it, perhaps seeking to gain the favor of the guards. In 1942, it was taken to the extreme that the camp commanders were allowed to order, if they so wished, the castration of these men. In another brutal case, in the Sachsenhausen camp, almost all the homosexual prisoners were killed within a short period of time. There was no other reason than to satisfy the desires of Nazi brutality. Lesbian women, although they did not have to wear the pink triangles on their uniforms, were not spared from the cruelty of the Germans. Many female prisoners were raped by guards during their forced stay in the concentration camps. Some of them could be executed or sent to the gas chambers to eliminate witnesses. This happened mostly with Jews, Slavs, or Roma. Although relations between Aryan men and these women, consensual or not, were prohibited by law so as not to sully the supposedly superior race, many fell victim anyway. The fact that they were lesbians served as an incentive for the brutal Germans, who felt that through sexual abuse they were correcting their deviation. Curiously, despite the risks, many women who led a heterosexual lifestyle before being sent to the camps, they're related to other people of the same sex. Although some of them were not lesbians, this was a way of seeking a little calm in places devoid of humanity. These relationships served to keep them sane during their confinement. In most of the known cases where this occurred, if both survived the experience, they would return to romantic or sexual relationships with men after the war. Lesbians also had to be careful of other prisoners. Many of them came from more culturally closed cities, which did not experience the social revolution of the Weimar Republic in the 1920s. For some of these women, same-sex relationships were just as reprehensible as the actions of the Nazis. As was mentioned with male homosexuals, they could be accused by their fellow prisoners of acts they did not commit. This often led to punishment by the guards, or sometimes even death. The support network that the prisoners had among themselves, in which food, sheets, or clothing were sometimes provided to those most in need, often bypassed lesbians.
Same-sex relationships in the camps could surprise some other detainees, creating diverse views on lesbians amid various cultures and backgrounds. Some survivors of the camps described lesbians in the camps as a threat to the safety and well-being of other prisoners, while others saw them as examples of degradation resulting from the camp experience.
Information about the experiences of these women under the Nazi regime is not as abundant as that of other minorities. This is partly because these practices were not viewed as negatively as male homosexuality or membership in other groups, such as Jews and communists. While persecution did occur, it was not as severe or as systemic. On the other hand, after the war, the freedom that existed during the Weimar Republic was not reinstated. In this respect, the culture regressed markedly even after the demise of Nazism. Lesbianism and homosexuality in general came to be considered taboo in society, and very few people were willing to give their testimony about their experiences. The law that criminalized relations between men was only removed from the German Constitution at the end of the 1960s, and it took even longer for it to be accepted by some groups in the country. Although lesbian women did not suffer as much from Nazi persecution, their fight against this tyrannical regime should not be overlooked, nor should that of all the other groups who were victims of its policies. We have reached the end of the video, and we want to ask you, are you surprised by the attitude of the Nazis towards lesbian women? Don't forget to leave your answer in the comments box, and remember to subscribe to our channel if you want to learn about many more military events that left their mark on history.